Ypres salient, Belgium, April 1915. In the gas-laden trenches of Flanders, soldiers whispered of a figure crucified in no man's land, its arms stretched wide beneath searchlights that revealed only emptiness. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of sacrifice, where the horrors of war blur the line between propaganda and truth. Historical records indicate that the Second Battle of Ypres began on April 22, 1915, marking the first large-scale use of poison gas on the Western Front. German forces released 168 tons of chlorine gas against French colonial troops, creating an apocalyptic scene as yellowish-green clouds rolled across no man's land. But amid the chaos of this infamous battle, something far more terrifying was taking shape in the mud-filled trenches of the Ypres salient. Corporal Arthur Rowe of the 1st Canadian Division had seen his share of horror since arriving at the front. A combat medic with steady hands and an even steadier mind, he'd earned a reputation for staying calm while treating the most grievous wounds. But nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he discovered in the early hours of April 24th. The night watch had reported strange movements in no man's land, shadows that seemed to dance between shell holes despite the absence of enemy activity. Private Thomas McKinnon, a fresh-faced replacement from Nova Scotia, claimed he'd seen a man suspended from a tree, arms outstretched like Christ himself. The other soldiers dismissed it as another case of trench fever, that peculiar madness that came from too many sleepless nights under artillery fire. Rowe might have dismissed it too, if not for the letter that arrived that morning from the 13th Battalion. Written in a shaking hand on blood-stained paper, it contained just 3 lines. "They're nailing our boys to trees, not for death, for something worse. The screaming never stops." When Lieutenant Harrison handed him the orders for a night patrol to investigate reports of a missing private, Rowe felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine. Fear? No, something deeper. A primal instinct warning him that some truths were better left buried in the mud of no man's land. As he assembled his patrol team, the evening sun cast long shadows across the trench walls. Someone had carved crude crosses into the timber supports, new ones, the wood still pale where the knife had cut deep. Private McKinnon, now assigned to Rowe's patrol, wouldn't look at them directly. "The men say it's a warning," McKinnon whispered, his voice barely audible over distant artillery. "Every cross marks a soul taken, not killed, taken." Rowe checked his medical kit one final time, making sure the morphine syrettes were easily accessible. Something told him this patrol would test more than just his medical skills. As dusk approached, the first flares illuminated the battlefield, casting an eerie glow over the cratered landscape. And there, just at the edge of visibility, a dark shape swayed gently in the evening breeze. The patrol preparation was interrupted by a runner from B Company. They'd found something in the ruins of a farmhouse near the front line. A leather-bound journal, its pages warped by rain and darker stains. The previous owner's name had been scratched out, replaced with a single line: "Let God forgive what we witnessed." Rowe settled into a dugout to examine the journal while his men gathered their equipment. The entries began normally enough: daily accounts of trench life, artillery barrages, and the endless mud. But the tone shifted dramatically after April 15th. The handwriting became erratic, the ink blotched by what appeared to be teardrops. April 16th. Heard screaming from no man's land tonight, different from the usual, rhythmic, almost like singing. Collins said the Germans were trying to break our spirits, but Germans don't sing in English. April 18th. They dragged another one away. We couldn't stop them. The shadows moved wrong, like men walking backwards. Found Colin's rosary in the mud. Beads were hot to touch. April 20th. The tree wasn't there yesterday. Everyone swears it. Just appeared, like it grew overnight. Already dead, no leaves. Perfect for their purpose. God help us, we can hear the hammering at night. The final entry chilled Roe's blood. The page was mostly blank except for a hastily scrawled message. They're not killing them. The nails aren't meant to end life. They're anchors, keeping something in or letting something out. The gas masks. Don't remove the gas masks. The face underneath isn't. The writing trailed off into a violent streak of ink. In the margin, a detailed technical drawing showed a tree with exact measurements and angles. More architectural diagram than battlefield sketch. Small notes marked precise nail placement points. The mathematical precision made it somehow worse. Lieutenant Harrison appeared at the dugout entrance, his face grave. Time to move out, Corporal. But there's something else you should know. We found this in the farmhouse, too. He handed Roe a worn identification tag. The name matched their missing private, but the date of death was listed as 2 weeks ago. That's impossible, Roe muttered. I treated his sprained ankle 3 days ago. Exactly, Harrison replied. And that farmhouse? It was in German territory until this morning. The journal's written in English. Make of that what you will. As Roe gathered his patrol, the evening mist began to take on a yellowish tinge. Not gas, wrong color, wrong movement, but it seemed to reach for them with purposeful tendrils as they prepared to enter no man's land. Private McKinnon crossed himself repeatedly, whispering what Roe first thought was a prayer, but listening closer, he realized McKinnon was reciting coordinates, the exact location where he'd seen the crucified figure. They were the same coordinates marked in the journal's final diagram. The 5-man patrol slipped over the trench parapet at 2300 hours. Besides Roe and McKinnon, there was Lance Corporal Davies, their best scout, Private Cooper, a former lumberjack whose strength might be needed, and Private Wells, a signalman who'd volunteered despite visible trembling. No man's land was unusually quiet. The constant artillery that had become like a heartbeat to the Western Front was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by their muffled footsteps in the mud. Even the German lines seemed dead, their usual flares conspicuously absent. The first sign something was wrong came when Davies' compass began to spin wildly. He tapped the glass, frowning. "Can't get a bearing, sir. Needle's gone mad." He held it out for Roe to see, then jerked his hand back with a curse. The compass was hot to the touch, its glass face clouding from the inside like breath on a cold window. They navigated by the terrain instead, using shell holes and broken equipment as markers. Cooper suddenly raised his fist, the signal to halt. In the dim moonlight, something dark was seeping up from the mud around their boots. Not blood, too thick, too dark. It had a sharp metallic smell that made their eyes water. Like the gas, Wells whispered, but wrong somehow, heavier. McKinnon's hand shot out, grabbing Roe's arm. "Listen." At first, Roe heard nothing. Then it came, a sound that had no place on a battlefield. Hammering, rhythmic, deliberate strikes of metal on metal, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. With each impact, the dark liquid at their feet rippled in perfect, concentric circles. They found the first body 50 yards further. A German soldier, partially buried in mud. His uniform oddly preserved. His gas mask was still attached, its filter missing. But it was his hands that made Cooper turn away and retch quietly. Every finger was broken backwards, and in his grip was a hammer, knuckles still white with tension. The hammering grew louder as they approached the coordinates from McKinnon's vision. The mist had thickened, taking on that unnatural yellow hue, but now threads of black writhed through it like ink in water. Wells began humming quietly, an old hymn that seemed to make the darkness retreat slightly. Then the mist parted, and they saw it. The tree stood alone in a perfect circle of dry ground, its bark blackened as if by intense heat. But it wasn't the tree that made hardened soldiers stumble backward in horror. It was the figure suspended from its branches and the terrible precision of its mounting. The engineering diagram in the journal had been exact. Every angle, every measurement, every nail placement, all perfect, all wrong. The figure wore British webbing and a gas mask, its uniform untouched by corruption. As they watched, its fingers twitched in a deliberate pattern, not random death spasms. It was signaling in British Army code. Davies translated in a shaking whisper, Please. The rest was lost as every compass in their kits exploded simultaneously, sending hot shards of glass and metal through their packs. In the sudden silence that followed, they heard it, the sound of wood creaking as the figure slowly turned its head to face them. "Hold your positions," Rowe ordered, his medical training warring with primal instinct. The figure's fingers danced their desperate code, while Davies stood transfixed by the gas mask's dark eyepieces. That perfect circle of scorched earth around the tree seemed to pulse with each movement. Cooper broke first. "It's Williams! Has to be!" He lunged forward before anyone could stop him, hands grasping the gas mask's straps. The air crystallized with sudden biting cold. Frost crackled across their uniforms as hammering erupted from beneath the mud, metal striking metal in a terrible rhythm. "Can't let go," Cooper gasped. "My hands." The mask tore free with a sound like ripping flesh. Wells's scream pierced the night. The face beneath wasn't Williams, wasn't human, just smooth, blank skin with a vertical line like a scar. As they watched, the line parted, revealing rows of impossible teeth. But the eyes were still in the mask itself, blinking wetly behind glass, rolling to focus on each man in turn. The figure's head tracked them with mechanical precision as its fingers shifted from military code to something older, something that made the yellow mist twist into shapes that hurt to look at. The hammering rose to a crescendo. "Run!" They fled through no man's land, but Cooper stumbled, the mask still clutched in his hands. The black liquid that had been seeping up from the ground suddenly surged, hardening into spikes that pinned him to the earth. His last scream was cut short by the wet sound of metal sliding through flesh. Rowe's mind recorded details, even as terror threatened to overwhelm him. The figure's impossible proportions, joints bent wrong, and the nails that seemed to grow from inside its body rather than pierce it. When they finally reached their lines at dawn, the trenches were empty except for rows of gas masks hanging on the walls, their eyepieces gleaming with hungry intelligence. And in the distance, carried on the morning wind, the hammering began again, and Rowe's report hit a wall of skeptical silence. The trenches had repopulated by mid-morning, soldiers emerging from deep dugouts claiming shelter from a gas attack. But he saw how they touched their masks with trembling fingers when they thought no one was watching. "Cooper's death will be listed as killed in action," Harrison said, sliding a folder across his desk. "The others don't speak of what they saw. That's an order." The reconnaissance photographs inside showed something impossible. The tree existed in only one image, dated April 15th, surrounded by shell holes, in a perfect circle. Each crater held a glint of metal. More nails, hundreds of them, all pointing inward like they were holding something in place. McKinnon found him later in the storage dugout, eyes wild with recognition. "The face," he whispered. "A soldier in the military hospital drew it constantly after a gas attack. Said it was what he saw in the clouds. Said it was wearing our faces." Wells burst in, clutching his signaler's log. The hammering, its coordinates, all places where gas was first used. His hands shook as he showed them the pattern. And they're spreading. Yellow mist seeped through the dugout's timber supports, carrying that metallic tang. Rowe finally recognized it. Not gas, but blood. Ancient blood, corrupted by something older than their war. Davies appeared, breathing hard. The trench walls. He led them to his post, where dozens of crosses had been carved overnight, each containing coordinates, future gas attack locations, and in the center, a crude tree that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. "It's not just spreading," McKinnon breathed. "The nails, the masks, the faces, they're doorways, and we're building them with every attack, every death, every drop of blood in the soil." The hammering started again, closer now, resonating from inside the trench walls. With it came the sound of roots growing, multiplied hundredfold, as if every tree in no man's land was reaching for the surface, reaching for them. Rowe's desperate plan took shape as night fell. If the nails were anchors, they could be broken. If blood fed the corruption, it could be starved. The original tree had to be destroyed before the pattern could complete itself. "You can't go back out there," Harrison argued. "That's what it wants. Every soldier who's seen behind the masks." He gestured helplessly at the medical reports spread across his desk. Dozens of men, found catatonic in shell holes, their gas masks fused to their faces, some still signaling in that ancient pattern. But Rowe had seen something in the journal's final pages that the others hadn't. Beneath the frantic warnings, barely visible, was a map drawn in blood. It showed the original tree's location relative to the German gas release points. The pattern wasn't random. It formed a symbol, an invitation. "We have to burn it," Rowe insisted, "before the next gas attack. Before—" He stopped. The hammering had begun again, but different now. It came from the medical bay. They found Wells there, standing over a wounded soldier. The signaler's hands were red with blood as he drove a nail into the man's gas mask, joining flesh to rubber with mechanical precision. His own mask's eyepieces blinked wetly as he turned to face them. The wounded began to rise from their beds, movements jerky and wrong. Black liquid dripped from their masks, hardening into cruel spikes. The hammering grew louder, drowning out their screams. Rowe and Harrison fled through the trenches, but the corruption was spreading faster now. Every gas mask they passed seemed to watch them, eyepieces gleaming with hungry intelligence. The very walls of the trench writhed as roots burst through, twisting into shapes that mimicked human forms. They found McKinnon at the forward position, still somehow himself. He'd been documenting everything in his own journal, adding to the growing record of horror. "The masks don't protect us from the gas," he said, showing them his sketches. "They never did. They prepare us, change us, make us ready for what's growing in no man's land." A flare burst overhead, illuminating the battlefield. The dead tree was no longer alone. Others had grown in the night, each bearing its own crucified figure. Their gas masks all turned in unison to stare at the three men. "The nails," Harrison whispered. "Look at the nails." They were spreading like roots through the bodies, branching and multiplying, transforming flesh into a latticework of living metal. And in the distance, carried on the wind, came the unmistakable hiss of releasing gas. This time, Rowe knew it wasn't German weapons. The yellow mist rose from the earth itself, called forth by the hammering that now filled the night like a heartbeat. The corruption had taken root. The doorways were opening, and behind every gas mask on the front, something ancient and patient waited to step through. Rowe made his choice as the yellow mist rolled across no man's land. "Get to the command post," he told Harrison. "Tell them to burn everything, every mask, every record, every diagram. It's the only way." McKinnon refused to leave, clutching his journal. "Someone has to document this. Someone has to know." His gas mask hung loose around his neck, untouched by the corruption spreading through the lines. They advanced together toward the original tree, carrying improvised incendiary charges. The hammering surrounded them now, rising from the earth with every step. Other figures emerged from the mist. Soldiers from both sides, their masks fused to their faces, moving with that terrible mechanical precision. The tree stood before them, its crucified figure still signaling. But Rowe finally understood the pattern, not a warning or a plea, an instruction, teaching others how to open the doorways, how to prepare vessels for what waited behind the masks. "It's not reaching out," McKinnon said suddenly. "It's reaching in. The nails don't hold it there. They hold us here, our world, our reality. The gas burns away the barriers, and the masks." He stopped, staring at something behind Rowe. Wells stood there, almost unrecognizable. The nails had spread through his body like veins of metal, breaking through his skin in crystalline patterns. His mask's eyepieces held that same wet gleam, but now Rowe saw the ancient intelligence behind them. Patient, hungry. "The war made this possible," Wells said, his voice distorted by more than just the mask. "All the death, the gas, the blood soaking the soil. Perfect conditions for something older to take root, to grow, to wear your faces." Other figures emerged, including Cooper's corrupted form. Their masks turned toward Rowe with predatory synchronization. The hammering reached a fever pitch as the yellow mist thickened. Rowe grabbed McKinnon's journal and threw it into the chemical-soaked mud. "Run, tell Harrison, tell everyone." The private hesitated, then fled into the mist as Rowe turned to face the creatures that had once been his fellow soldiers. He felt the corruption trying to take hold, the nails growing beneath his skin. But in his pocket, he still carried a single incendiary charge, just enough to burn away the roots of what had taken hold here. The hammering stopped. In the sudden silence, Rowe looked up at the crucified figure. It had turned its blank face toward him, that vertical line parting to reveal its terrible smile. And in that moment, he understood the true horror. He wasn't looking at it. He was looking out through it. Official military records list Corporal Arthur Rowe as killed in action during a German gas attack on April 25, 1915. His body was never recovered. The only evidence of his fate was found years later in a sealed military archive, a single gas mask, its rubber strangely uncorrupted, with a diagram etched into the filter. The same diagram found in shell hole patterns across the Western Front. The War Office classified all records of the crucified soldier incident as war propaganda. But to this day, construction projects along the old front lines occasionally unearth unusual metal objects. Nails, some say, though their composition remains unknown. And in nearby trenches they find gas masks. Their eyepieces still somehow wet, still watching, still waiting. McKinnon's journal survived, though heavily censored. Its final entry reads simply, The masks don't protect us from the gas. They protect the gas from what we might become, what we might see. God help us if they ever come off. If this document from the War Maestro's archive has left you questioning the true purpose of your old military gear, perhaps it's time to join our battalion of truth seekers. Before you go, check your gas mask and pray those eyepieces don't blink back at you. Subscribe to access more classified files from humanity's darkest battlefields and activate that notification bell. You'll want to know the moment our next restricted file becomes declassified. Share this account with fellow soldiers who understand that some military legends aren't legends at all. Has your unit ever encountered something in no man's land that shouldn't exist? Or perhaps you've heard the sound of hammering where no hammer should be. Leave your experiences in the comments below. Remember, every military archive has its secrets, and some documents are still waiting to be found. Just be careful what you uncover. Not every face behind the mask is the one you expect to see. The War Maestro will return.